Life in a medieval winter, cold, cruel, and unforgiving. Winter in the Middle Ages was not just a season, it was a brutal test of endurance. For the average medieval peasant, there was no central heating, no insulation, and no real way to escape the biting cold. People lived in crude, drafty wooden homes with gaps wide enough for chickens to squeeze through. These walls offered little protection from wind, snow, or freezing temperatures. Windows, if they existed at all, were not made of glass but were often covered with cloth, parchment, or oiled hide to block out the chill, none of which were particularly effective. Inside these dim and damp huts, the only source of heat was a central hearth. The idea of a warm, crackling fire sounds comforting in theory, but the reality was far less cozy. Firewood was expensive, scarce, and sometimes even illegal to collect, especially in forests owned by the nobility or the church. Gathering firewood without permission could be met with harsh punishments, even death. So many peasants were forced to ration what little fuel they had, if any, saving it for cooking or extreme cold. As a result, winter nights were long and miserable. Most peasants owned only one or two wool garments, which were rarely washed and often damp. A cold, soggy tunic was hardly enough protection from frost. Blankets, if they had them, were thin and shared among entire families. People often huddled together for warmth, their breath forming mist in the frigid air inside their own homes. It wasn't uncommon to wake up with your nose nearly frozen, your feet numb, and your hands so stiff you could barely use them. Frostbite wasn't understood in any medical sense, it was just another hazard of life, one people referred to as bad luck. If your fingers or toes turned black and fell off, there was no treatment. You were simply expected to carry on, assuming you survived the infection. And survive you must, because no one had the luxury of stopping work due to the weather. Tasks still had to be done, animals fed, fire stoked, bread baked, clothes patched. The dampness made everything worse. Without insulation or ventilation, the walls and floors of homes were often soaked with moisture, creating a constant chill that settled deep into the bones. The cold wasn't just outside, it was everywhere. You couldn't escape it, not even in sleep. It was the background hum of every waking moment. Even during daylight hours, winter brought little relief. The sun, when visible, barely warmed the earth. Days were short and often overcast. Walking outside meant facing cutting winds and slippery, icy ground. And yet, people still had to venture out to fetch water, collect scraps of wood, tend to animals, or trudge through snow to attend religious obligations. There was no winter fashion in the modern sense, just layers of rough, itchy wool, often damp from snow or sweat, and heavy cloaks made from whatever materials people could find. Shoes were rudimentary and usually let in the cold, making feet especially vulnerable. Wet socks, if you had any, only added to the misery. Mittens or gloves were rare. People relied on wrapping their hands in cloth or simply hiding them in their sleeves. Illness ran rampant during winter. Colds, flus, and respiratory infections were common, but medical help was virtually non-existent. People treated ailments with herbs or old remedies passed down through families, and prayer was often the only medicine available. A persistent cough or fever in winter could easily turn fatal. Children and the elderly were especially vulnerable. Many didn't survive past their first harsh winter. For them, the cold was not just uncomfortable, it was deadly. Deaths from exposure, malnutrition, and illness were tragically common and accepted as part of life. In the medieval winter, there were no snow days or cozy fireplaces. There was only the relentless cold, the ever-present hunger, and the constant need to keep going, no matter how frozen your limbs, no matter how weak your body. It was a season of survival, not celebration. Every winter was a battle, and those who made it to spring did so with frostbitten fingers, chapped skin, and gratitude that they had managed to live another year. Medieval summer, sweat, stench, and suffering. If you thought surviving a medieval winter was hard, don't expect summer to offer much relief. The changing season didn't mean freedom from discomfort, it simply replaced one form of suffering with another. Gone were the days of frostbitten toes and frozen fingers. In their place came sunburned skin, suffocating heat, and relentless insects. For the average peasant, summer was not a time for relaxation, it was a season of sweat, misery, and exhaustion. Medieval homes were poorly built to handle the cold, and they were even worse at managing heat. With no insulation and no ventilation, these small wooden huts turned into sweltering ovens in the summer. The thick walls and thatched roofs trapped heat inside, making daytime unbearable and night stifling. There were no fans, no breezes, and certainly no air conditioning. People roasted in their own homes, drenched in sweat with no way to cool down. Changing into lighter clothing wasn't an option either. Modesty ruled medieval life, and removing layers was considered scandalous, even during the hottest days. Exposing too much skin could lead to social shame or religious disapproval. So peasants endured the heat while wearing thick wool or coarse linen, clothing that clung to their sweaty bodies and chafed their skin raw. Heat rash and skin irritation were common, but not something anyone had time, or resources, to treat. And then there were the insects. Flies were everywhere, swarming to the unwashed bodies and the smell of old food. Without modern hygiene, the average person gave off a powerful odor. The stench of sweat, animals, smoke, and spoiled food hung in the air like a permanent cloud. Mosquitoes buzzed incessantly, especially at night, making sleep difficult. They carried disease and left people with itchy, irritated bites. But there was no repellent, just enduring. The days were long, and the sun was merciless. For those working in the fields, and that was most of the population, the summer heat was not something they could avoid. The blazing sun beat down on bare heads and backs. Hats were a luxury. If you were lucky, you might have a makeshift straw cap, but for many, there was nothing between their scalp and the sky. Sunburns were painful and frequent, and long hours in the sun could lead to heatstroke, though back then, no one had a name for it. People just said you had taken a bad turn, and hoped you lived through it. Rest was nearly impossible. With more daylight came more work. Crops needed tending, livestock needed care, and harvest time loomed. Everyone was expected to contribute, even children and the elderly. There were no summer holidays or lazy afternoons, only the endless labor demanded by survival. The heat didn't excuse anyone from their duties, even the air itself felt heavy. The mixture of humidity, smoke from cooking fires, rotting food, and human waste created an almost tangible staleness. There was no deodorant, no perfume, no relief from the overwhelming scent of daily life. Living in close quarters with large families meant no privacy and little fresh air. Sleeping during summer was another struggle. The inside of a peasant's home was stifling, especially at night. The heat didn't disappear when the sun went down. If anything, it intensified inside the sealed huts. People tossed and turned on straw mattresses, itching from sweat and flea bites, while listening to the buzzing of mosquitoes and the occasional argument or baby crying next door. It was a restless, miserable kind of sleep, if one could sleep at all, and through all of this, one constant remained: the food was still terrible, the work never stopped, and your clothes still itched. In summer, survival was not just about enduring heat, it was about adapting to a life where discomfort was constant and relief was almost non-existent. Medieval summer wasn't a season of joy. It was a time when your body was pushed to the brink, your patience was tested daily, and your ability to keep going, despite the heat, the bugs, and the unrelenting work, was your only real protection. There was no escaping the sun, no cool breeze waiting at the end of the day, and no one to complain to. You simply kept sweating and hoped you made it to the first cool breath of autumn. Water in the Middle Ages, the hidden danger. In modern life, water is a symbol of health and refreshment. We drink it, wash with it, and use it in countless daily routines without fear. But in the Middle Ages, water was far from your friend. Instead of offering comfort or cleanliness, it often carried disease, death, and despair. To the average medieval peasant, water was not a source of life, it was a constant, quiet threat. Let's begin with the most basic need, drinking. A clear, bubbling stream may look pristine to modern eyes, but in medieval times, appearances were deceiving. The same stream that seemed to offer clean water for your cup might have been polluted just yards upstream. Chamber pots were emptied into rivers, animals bathed and died in them, and waste from homes and streets often flowed directly into the same water source used for drinking. There were no water purification systems, no understanding of bacteria or contamination. Each sip was a gamble. People had no idea why drinking from the stream might make them violently ill, they just knew that it often did. Diarrhea, dysentery, and worse came from seemingly innocent water. Entire communities could be affected by outbreaks that started with one contaminated source. To avoid this danger, people turned to a surprising alternative, beer. Even children drank it. This wasn't the strong, alcoholic beer of modern times but a weaker version known as small beer. It was just alcoholic enough to kill microbes through the boiling process during brewing. It provided hydration without the same risk of waterborne illness. Beer became the default drink not because people loved the taste, but because it was safer than water. Wine was another option, but only for the wealthy. It was expensive and imported in many regions, often reserved for nobles and clergy. The average peasant rarely, if ever, tasted wine, let alone drank it as a daily habit. What about using water for bathing? Theoretically, yes, it was possible. In practice, it was uncommon and, in some cases, feared. Medieval beliefs about health were rooted in superstition and a flawed understanding of the body. One widespread idea was that bathing opened the pores and made the body vulnerable to disease. Rather than seeing water as a cleanser, many believed it actually let sickness in. As a result, regular bathing was considered dangerous. People went weeks, sometimes months, without washing their bodies. A thick layer of grime wasn't a sign of neglect, it was viewed as a kind of protective barrier. Dirt kept the bad humors out, or so they thought. Smelling bad was normal. Being too clean was considered suspicious. Public bathhouses did exist in some towns and cities. These communal spaces were social centers, where people gathered not just to wash, but to gossip, relax, and sometimes engage in more scandalous behavior. Their growing reputation as places of immorality eventually drew the attention of the church, which condemned many and had them shut down. With bathhouses disappearing and private bathing difficult and costly, most people simply stopped bothering. Even if you wanted to bathe at home, it was an ordeal. You had to fetch water from a well, if your village had one, carry it back in heavy buckets, boil it over a fire, and pour it into a wooden tub that often leaked. It was time-consuming, exhausting, and rarely worth the effort. You also had to hope no one else in your household used the water before, or worse, after, you did. Rainwater might seem like a convenient solution, but it came with its own problems. Collected in open barrels, it quickly became a breeding ground for insects and algae. Birds often perched on the edges, leaving droppings behind. The water became stale and foul-smelling, hardly the refreshing cleanse one might hope for. In agriculture, water posed yet another challenge. Irrigation was primitive, and flooding or drought could wipe out entire crops. Rain was unpredictable, and streams could dry up or overflow. Farmers lived in constant tension with the elements. Too much water could rot your harvest. Too little, and everything died. In essence, water in the medieval world was not the source of vitality we know today. It was a silent, ever-present hazard. Whether you were trying to drink it, bathe in it, or use it on your fields, it came with risks and few rewards. Disease lurked in every cup, effort weighed down every bath, and fear shadowed every use, so the next time you enjoy a glass of clean tap water or take a hot shower, remember, your medieval ancestors weren't so lucky. For them, water didn't quench thirst or offer relief. It tested their survival, one drop at a time. Medieval medicine, a painful path to healing. If you lived in the Middle Ages and got sick, your chances of recovery were slim, and sometimes, the cure was worse than the disease. Medicine in medieval Europe was a strange mix of superstition, outdated science, and blind faith. Treatments were based more on guesswork and religious doctrine than on any real understanding of the human body. Seeing a doctor didn't mean you'd get better, it just meant your suffering would become a bit more official. Let's begin with diagnosis. The medical system of the time was based on the ancient Greek theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. It was believed that all illnesses, mental or physical, came from imbalances between these fluids. So whether you had a fever, a broken leg, or were just feeling anxious, your problem could be blamed on your humors. Got a fever? You probably had too much blood. The solution? Bloodletting. Physicians, barbers, or anyone with a sharp object would cut you open or apply leeches to drain your blood, believing this would restore balance. This treatment often weakened patients further, and many died not from the original illness, but from the cure. Sad or withdrawn. That was probably due to an excess of black bile. The remedy? A dose of laxatives to purge the system. Suffering from headaches or hallucinations? That might be treated with herbal tonics, prayers, or simply ignored, until your neighbors accused you of being possessed or a witch. It gets worse. If you had a wound or broken bone, you'd face a kind of surgery that bordered on torture. There was no anesthesia, and no understanding of germs. Tools weren't sterilized. Why bother, when nobody knew infection came from bacteria? Knives were heated over a fire, not to kill microbes, but to stop bleeding or simply frighten the patient into submission. Amputations were performed with crude tools, and patients were expected to bite down on leather or wood to avoid screaming too loudly. If you passed out from the pain, that was the closest thing to anesthesia you'd get. Infections were common, and the odds of survival after surgery were low, especially without antibiotics, which wouldn't be discovered for centuries. If you had something like the plague or another infectious disease, your treatment might be spiritual rather than medical. It was widely believed that illnesses were a punishment from God for sinful behavior. So instead of giving you medicine, the priest might arrive to perform last rites. You'd be urged to confess your sins and pray for forgiveness. Because many thought your best shot at healing was divine mercy, not a doctor, even relatively common problems like stomach aches were treated in absurd ways. You might be fed crushed beetles, ground herbs, or other bizarre concoctions. Sometimes, the only treatment you got was to be left alone in a dark room with a priest by your side and a grave being dug nearby, just in case. Doctors at the time often relied more on astrology than anatomy. They believed the positions of the stars and planets affected your health. So before treating you, they might consult a star chart to see whether Venus or Mars was interfering with your liver. Unsurprisingly, this didn't improve survival rates. Ironically, barbers were often more involved in medical care than many trained physicians. The classic barber pole with its red and white stripes actually represents blood and bandages. Barbers didn't just cut hair, they also performed tooth extractions, bloodletting, and minor surgeries. So you might get a shave and a finger amputated in the same chair. Recovery, if it happened, was usually chalked up to God's mercy, not the skill of the doctor. If a patient died, it wasn't seen as a failure of the treatment, it was just fate or divine will. If you survived, the doctor claimed success, the priest claimed credit, and the leech probably got reused for the next patient. In the end, medieval medicine was a terrifying blend of ignorance, superstition, and guesswork. There was no understanding of hygiene, bacteria, or internal organs. The human body was treated like a mystery box: open it up, poke around, and hope for the best. People didn't go to the doctor expecting a cure, they went because they had no other option. So if you're feeling under the weather today and can call a modern physician, consider yourself lucky. In the Middle Ages, medicine was less about healing and more about surviving the treatment. Dining in the Middle Ages, a daily gamble with death, after a long, exhausting day of labor, cold winds, and crude medical care, you finally return to your tiny, dark hovel with one hope in mind: a warm meal to fill your belly and lift your spirits. Unfortunately, in the Middle Ages, food wasn't a source of comfort, it was just another test of endurance. Eating wasn't about nutrition or pleasure. It was a daily game of chance, where the stakes were your health and survival. Let's start with the basics. Food preservation as we know it didn't exist. There were no refrigerators, no freezers, no vacuum-sealed containers. The only tools for preserving food were salt, smoke, drying, and wishful thinking. If you had meat, and that was a luxury, it had likely been hanging for several days, possibly covered in flies, and might have started to rot. You either ate it or went hungry. And yes, many shared their meat with the local rodents who were just as desperate as you. Bread was the cornerstone of most medieval diets, but even this staple wasn't always safe. In years of poor harvest, people got desperate. To stretch their supplies, they might add things like sawdust, bark, or even clay to the dough. This made the bread last longer, but it also made it dangerous. Sometimes, the bread was made from rye infected with ergot, a fungus that caused terrifying symptoms like convulsions, hallucinations, and even death. Eating this bread was like swallowing a loaf laced with LSD and food poisoning. When it came to vegetables, peasants ate what was in season, which wasn't much. Turnips, onions, and cabbage were common, so common, in fact, that they became a monotonous presence in every meal. Your dinner might consist of boiled turnips in a thick stew, known as pottage. This dish was a mystery pot of ingredients thrown together, sometimes simmering for days. Leftovers from one day were added to the next, and so on, until the flavor resembled something between swamp water and regret. Fruit was a rare treat, available only in certain seasons and for a short time. Without modern preservation methods, it rotted quickly. And since sugar was incredibly rare and expensive, sweetening anything was almost impossible. The wealthy hoarded sugar as a luxury item and a status symbol, often flaunting their blackened, decaying teeth as proof of their wealth. Dairy was another risky food group. Milk spoiled in just a few hours, especially in warm weather. Cheese and butter lasted longer, but they weren't necessarily safer. They were filled with bacteria, and their taste varied depending on what animals were fed or how the products were handled. Yet people ate them anyway. When your choices are week-old cheese or going to bed hungry, the decision is simple: what about flavor? Well, if you think medieval food was bland, you're half right. For the poor, spices were out of reach. Things like pepper, cinnamon, and nutmeg were worth more than gold. Only the rich could afford them. For everyone else, flavor came from onions, salt, if they were lucky, or whatever they found growing in the yard. Most meals tasted like wet burlap soaked in disappointment. Eating was also politically dangerous. Game animals, rabbits, deer, and wild birds, belonged to the local lord, not the peasants. If you were caught poaching, you could be fined, imprisoned, or even executed. That's right, catching a rabbit for your starving family could get you hanged. So even when food was available, it came with risk. Dinner was typically eaten by firelight, if you had a fire at all. You might gather around a wooden table, if your family was lucky enough to own one, and eat with your hands or share a spoon. There were no formal dining sets. Napkins were unknown, and hygiene was not a priority. It was common to share bowls and cups, increasing the chances of spreading illness, though no one knew it at the time. Despite all this, people ate. They had to. Food was essential, but it was also a test of endurance. Every bite carried risk. Would this stew make you sick? Would the bread drive you mad? Would the spoiled milk give you cramps, or worse, for the wealthy, meals were grand affairs with roast meats, fresh fruits, imported spices, and servants on hand. But for the average peasant, food was just another obstacle in an already difficult life. Eating wasn't about enjoyment, it was about surviving to the next day, so, the next time you enjoy a fresh sandwich or sip a cold smoothie, take a moment to appreciate the miracle of safe, reliable food. In the Middle Ages, a meal didn't satisfy hunger, it tested your luck. And more often than not, that luck ran out. In the Middle Ages, religion wasn't just part of life, it was the foundation of existence. It wasn't a choice, a personal belief, or a Sunday routine. It was an all-encompassing force that dictated how people lived, thought, worked, married, ate, and even died. The church was more than a place of worship, it was the supreme authority, the enforcer of law, the guardian of knowledge, and the interpreter of truth. In medieval Europe, God was the king of heaven, and the church was his kingdom on earth. Your daily life, regardless of whether you were a peasant or a noble, revolved around the church calendar. The bells from the local church tower marked the rhythm of the day, morning prayers, midday prayers, evening prayers. Missing these wasn't just seen as lazy, it was a sin. Everything had a moral implication. Bowing at the wrong time. Sin. Eating meat on Friday. Sin. Harboring a lustful thought during a dream. Double sin. Hell was vividly real in the minds of medieval people. Priests described it in terrifying detail, rivers of fire, lakes of boiling blood, devils with pitchforks, and eternal suffering. These were not just metaphors, they were accepted as future destinations for the sinful. With plagues, famines, and wars constantly threatening life, people genuinely feared death, and even more so, feared what might come after. Access to religious knowledge was tightly controlled. The Bible was written in Latin, a language that most ordinary people couldn't read. Only the clergy, monks, and a handful of educated nobles could understand it. That meant regular people depended entirely on priests to interpret God's word. Whatever the priest said was law, not just spiritual law, but often local and political law too. If your crops failed, the priest might tell you it was because you didn't pray hard enough. If you got sick, maybe it was because of your sins. Religion explained everything, from natural disasters to bad luck. Tithing was another inescapable obligation. You were expected to give 10% of all your income to the church. That meant a tenth of your harvest, your livestock, your coins, whatever you had. Even if you were starving or in debt, the tithe had to be paid. Failing to do so meant not just social shame but also divine punishment. The church didn't just take your grain, it took spiritual control of your life. Holy days, or holidays, were not times for relaxation or joy. Instead, they were structured around fasting, attending Mass, confession, and acts of penance. These days might have offered a break from physical labor, but they were not recreational. Laughter, dancing, or too much pleasure could be viewed as immoral. Joy was considered suspicious, an indulgence that could lead to sin. Questioning the church was dangerous business. The church did not tolerate skepticism or criticism. People who disagreed with church teachings, or who simply thought too independently, could be branded as heretics, blasphemers, or even witches. Punishments ranged from public floggings to excommunication, imprisonment, and execution by burning or drowning. The infamous Inquisitions and witch hunts were the result of this paranoia and control. The church also regulated education, and most schools were run by monasteries. If you learned to read or write, you likely did so under the supervision of a monk. Scientific progress was limited. Since anything that contradicted religious doctrine could be labeled heresy. The earth was the center of the universe. God created the world in 7 days, and anything else was forbidden thought. Religious institutions held a monopoly on books, which were handwritten by monks and locked away in monasteries. Religious control extended into every major life event. From birth, a child was baptized. Marriages had to be blessed by the church. Confession and penance were regular duties. Death was not the end, it was a transition to eternal judgment, and so last rites were essential. If a priest did not perform them, people feared the soul would be lost forever. Social order was also shaped by religious hierarchy. The idea that kings ruled by divine right meant that challenging the king was the same as challenging God. The Pope, as God's representative, could even depose monarchs, call for wars, like the Crusades, and excommunicate entire kingdoms. No one, not even royalty, was beyond the reach of the church. Your neighbor might also play a part in this web of control. People were encouraged to report religious misconduct, and gossip could easily lead to someone being accused of sin or heresy. You were never just living your life, you were constantly performing piety, watched by God, the priest, and even your neighbor Agnes, who would absolutely tell the church if you skipped Mass. In this world, faith wasn't about personal spirituality. It was about obedience, survival, and maintaining your place in a system that left little room for questioning. The church was your judge, your school, your government, and your only hope for salvation, assuming the priest liked you. So while the Middle Ages were full of suffering from nature, war, and poverty, the most powerful force was invisible, all-seeing, and eternal. In the Middle Ages, religion didn't just guide your soul. It ruled your life. Being a woman in the Middle Ages, life on the hardest difficulty setting, to be born a woman in the Middle Ages was to begin life at a severe disadvantage, socially, legally, economically, and even spiritually. Women had little control over their own lives, few rights, and were seen as inferior to men in nearly every way. In many respects, being a medieval woman was like playing life on the hardest possible difficulty setting, with no cheats, no saves, and very few chances to win. From the moment a girl was born, her destiny was largely pre-written. She didn't belong to herself. As a child, she was the property of her father. As an adult, she became the property of her husband. She couldn't own land in most cases. Couldn't vote, not that commoners could anyway, and had no say in who she married. Marriages were arranged, and often at shockingly young ages. A girl might be promised to a man before she reached her teens, and wed soon after her first period, as early as 12 or 13 years old. Love was irrelevant, marriage was a contract to secure property, power, or family ties. Virginity was currency. A woman's worth in society, especially among the noble classes, was largely defined by whether she was a virgin before marriage. Her purity was not just a personal matter, it was a family's honor, a political strategy, a dowry negotiating tool. If a woman was found not to be a virgin on her wedding night, she could be publicly humiliated, disowned, or worse. In some cases, she might be accused of witchcraft or adultery, both of which could carry the death penalty. Daily life for most women, particularly peasants, was an endless loop of labor. They worked from dawn until nightfall, tending crops, gathering firewood, fetching water, cooking for large families, weaving cloth, spinning wool, raising children, and caring for the sick, all without recognition or rest. There were no weekends, no maternity leave, and definitely no self-care days. Even pregnant women continued working in the fields until they gave birth, and were expected to return shortly afterward. Giving birth itself was incredibly dangerous. Without modern medicine, hospitals, or trained professionals, many women died during childbirth or shortly afterward from infections or complications. Midwives did their best, but even they were often looked upon with suspicion, especially if something went wrong. Stillbirths, miscarriages, and maternal deaths were tragically common. And if a woman survived, she was often expected to produce many more children, whether her body could handle it or not, and yet, women were often blamed for the pains of childbirth, a direct result of the biblical story of Eve. The Church taught that Eve's sin brought suffering to the world, and that women were inherently more sinful, weaker, and more prone to temptation. This belief wasn't just theological, it was woven into law, medicine, and daily social attitudes. Women were believed to be mentally unstable, overly emotional, and naturally deceitful. It was said that they needed the control of a man, father, husband, or priest, to behave properly. For noble women, life wasn't necessarily easier, it was just a different type of prison. While they were spared manual labor, their lives were consumed by expectations of obedience, elegance, and submission. They were often locked away in castles, forced into marriages with much older men, and valued primarily for their ability to bear sons. If they failed to do so, they risked being cast aside or replaced. A woman who gave birth to only daughters might be pitted, or blamed. Education for women was rare. Peasant girls received no formal schooling. Noble girls might be taught basic reading, embroidery, etiquette, and religious instruction, but certainly not philosophy, politics, or science. The idea of an intelligent, educated woman was seen as dangerous, even heretical. A woman who spoke too confidently or asked too many questions could be accused of being unnatural, or a witch. The witch hunts of the Middle Ages and later periods were a horrifying example of how society viewed women with suspicion. Most people accused of witchcraft were women, often elderly, poor, widowed, or simply odd. If a woman spoke her mind, practiced herbal medicine, or lived alone, she could easily be accused. Torture, forced confessions, and brutal executions followed. There was no fair trial, and no way out once accused. Despite all of this, medieval women found ways to survive, adapt, and sometimes resist. Some became skilled midwives, healers, or wise women, using their knowledge to help their communities, even if it meant living in fear. Some joined convents, where they could receive education and avoid the dangers of childbirth. A few rare women, like Eleanor of Aquitaine or Hildegard of Bingen, rose to positions of influence, but these were exceptions, not the rule. Ultimately, to be a woman in the Middle Ages meant to live under constant control and constant judgment. You were expected to be silent, obedient, and invisible, but still work endlessly, raise children, manage a household, and uphold your family's reputation. Your body was not your own. Your choices were made for you. Your suffering was explained away as your natural condition, and yet, medieval women endured. They raised generations through wars, plagues, and poverty. They passed down knowledge, preserved culture, and held families together. In a world that gave them almost nothing, they survived with courage, grit, and quiet strength. But make no mistake, it was life on nightmare mode, and the game was rigged from the start. The romanticized image of the Middle Ages as a time of noble knights and peaceful villages couldn't be further from the truth. In reality, medieval life was marked by instability, fear, and frequent violence. The concept of law and order existed, but it was often ineffective, inconsistent, and heavily dependent on the temperament and power of the local lord. There was no unified legal system to speak of. Justice varied from village to village and was frequently arbitrary. Violence was a regular part of everyday life. It occurred in all corners of medieval society, inside homes due to domestic disputes, on the streets where brawls and theft were common, and on battlefields that erupted over land. Power, or religious differences. Even churches weren't immune. Religious disagreements could escalate into physical fights, with clergy and congregants caught up in disputes that turned sacred spaces into war zones. Crime was rampant. Theft, assault, and even murder were not unusual, especially in overcrowded towns where poverty and desperation drove people to extreme actions. This often resulted in selective justice. Nobles might walk free for crimes that would get a peasant publicly whipped or worse. In short, justice in the Middle Ages was not about protecting the innocent or ensuring fairness. It was often about maintaining power, enforcing obedience, and setting an example, however cruel it needed to be. Life under such conditions was harsh, unpredictable, and frequently unjust. For most people, peace and safety were hopes rather than realities.